Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we're going to get this program of the Vermont Historical Society's Winter Speaker Series started. We're so glad you're joining us today for this talk, which is really going to be a wonderful one. I have a few housekeeping notes to clear up before we get started. First is that this program is being hosted by the Vermont Historical Society, and we would be delighted if you would join us for future programming, learn more about our work, choose to support us by donating or becoming a member, and you can do all of that at vermonthistory.org, all one word, all spelled out, so please do check that out. This program is part of an ongoing winter speaker series. The next one will be April 23rd. With speaker Sarah Gregg, who will be speaking about landscape change, land use planning, and social change during the 1930s in Vermont. It's going to be a really wonderful program. We'll talk more about that at the very end. Please know today's program is also being recorded through Zoom, and we are using the Zoom webinar app, which may look a little bit different from Zoom programs that you have experienced before. It provides a question and answer function. It's down on your taskbar. It's labeled Q&A. It's got little chat boxes. You can submit questions for the speaker using that Q&A function. And at the end, I will come back and pose them to our speaker. We often find we don't have enough time to answer all of the questions during our program today. So in this case especially, I'm going to strongly encourage that if you don't get the chance to get your question answered, or if you have a million more questions, you check out our speaker's book, and I'll talk more about that briefly. Finally, before I introduce our speaker, I just want to read briefly our land acknowledgement, which is that the Vermont Historical Society acknowledges that we do our work on land that has long served as a site of meeting and exchange of Indigenous peoples. The Western Abenaki have long been caretakers of this land, which they call Ndakina. We seek to address historical exclusion by embracing an inclusive understanding of the Vermont experience. In partnership with multiple communities, we educate the public about inequities as we work to change our own institution. So it is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rachel Hope Cleves. Rachel Hope Cleves is a professor of history at the University of Victoria and a member of the Royal Society of Canada. She is the author of 3 books of history. Charity and Sylvia, the subject of today's talk, was published in 2014. She published a book called Unspeakable in 2020 and The Reign of Terror in America in 2020 as well. She's also the author of a science fiction novel that will be published in the summer of 2023 and is now at work on a history of food and sex from the late 18th century through the present day. We're extremely excited to have her here to speak about her book, Charity and Sylvia, which some of you may remember when it made quite a lot of headlines when it was published. And we've been in touch with Rachel Hope Cleves over the years, but one of the benefits of doing programs through Zoom now is that we're able to have her join us all the way from British Columbia. It's a wonderful silver lining to this remote world that we live in right now. So it is absolutely my pleasure to welcome Rachel to our program and to turn the program over to her to turn on her video and start her slide share. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that introduction. And let me start my slideshow. All right, this looks good. Well, thank you all for joining me today. I'm sorry I'm not in Vermont because it's been too long since I've visited, but I am also grateful for the ability through Zoom now to speak remotely and make this talk, which we've been talking about for a long time, happen. So I am coming to you today from Victoria, British Columbia, which is the traditional lands of the Lekwungen peoples, the Sanghees, Wasanich, and Esquimalt people whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Lekwungen means a place to smoke herring, and as a settler from a displaced people who also came from lands and where smoked herring were common and who loved smoked herring, I want to express my strong sense of connection to this beautiful place and my gratitude for living and working on these lands today. So my talk today is divided into 3 parts: a brief introduction, followed by an account of Charity and Sylvia's marriage, with an explanation for why I use the word married to describe them, and finally, an explanation of Charity and Sylvia's role within the marriage as man and wife. When I started writing Charity and Sylvia, my book on which this talk is based, same-sex marriage was illegal in most of the United States. I submitted the manuscript to my press in 2013, the year that the Supreme Court decision of United States v. Windsor struck down DOMA, or the Defense of Marriage Act. The book was published in spring of 2014, and then in June 2015, the Supreme Court decision of Obergefell v. Hodges legalized same-sex marriage throughout the US. Since that time, the optimistic among us have assumed that the legal question of same-sex marriage was permanently resolved. However, at yesterday's Senate hearings for the Supreme Court nominee, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Republican Senator John Cornyn indicated that the GOP believes that Obergefell was wrongly decided, and that, as with Roe v. Wade, they hope to use their new majority on the court to overturn the decision. In light of Cornyn's remarks and his assertion that religious groups all oppose same-sex marriage, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to tell you the story of Charity and Sylvia and the honored place they held in their religious early 19th century Vermont village. So glance at the 2 framed silhouettes of Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake, cut by an itinerant artist who visited their Vermont village in the 1800s. And one is struck immediately by the image's similarities. Both faces have sharp pointed noses. Both wear identical buns with 2 twists of hair perched atop their foreheads and 2 wisps curled down the napes of their necks. Perhaps the bust on the right has a slightly thicker neck. The angle of the head of the bust on the left might just tilt slightly downwards, but both images convey essentially an identical impression of 19th century American white middle-class femininity. The only hint that the women captured by these twin portraits may have differed from that standard of American womanhood is the design drawn by the braided hair that frames their images. Certainly, there's nothing out of the ordinary about the use of hair as decoration in a 19th century image, although hair art is so alien to our own times that when I was discussing possible cover images with the book's marketing team and I wanted to include this, they said absolutely not, that it would completely repel or repulse potential readers. So, and you'll see that the cover doesn't have the hair on it. What is unusual about the presence of hair in this 19th century twin silhouettes is the shape the hair assumes, and in particular, the obvious heart framed between the twinned bosoms of the women. So most often, 19th century hair art marked births and deaths. It frequently appeared in mourning books or pieces of jewelry or as a memory of loss. In Charity and Sylvia's silhouettes, on the other hand, the appearance of the braided heart combined with the orientation of the portraits facing each other within a single frame made of their braided hair conveyed a message of romantic unity of souls and bodies that, in the grammar of early America, signaled marriage. So here are some examples of that pose in a 19th century, or the interlocking hearts in a 19th century marriage prayer. And here's a set of married silhouettes from the same time period. And another close-up of those interlocking hearts from the marriage silhouette. So far from what we would expect at first glance, given their silhouettes, these 2 ordinary appearing women lived in an extraordinary union that challenges our assumptions about the history of marriage, sexuality, and gender in early America. Their seeming sameness is misleading, a misapprehension that obscures their differences from each other, from the era's standards of middle-class femininity, and from other couples at their time. So part 1, Miss Bryant and Miss Drake were married to each other. As Ripton native Hiram Harvey Hurlburt Jr. recalled late in life, when he was a boy during the 1830s, he went to have a suit cut at the shop of two tailoresses in Weybridge, Vermont. After becoming acquainted with the women, Hurlburt recalled that he, quote, heard it mentioned as if Miss Bryant and Miss Drake were married to each other. On further acquaintance, Hurlburt observed that Miss Bryant was the man, which he thought perfectly proper considering her authoritative personality. Hurlburt's memoir offers the plainest statement that Charity and Sylvia's relationship was broadly understood within their community to be a proper and respectable marriage. Who were these two married tailoresses? Charity Bryant was born in 1777 in North Bridgewater, 20 miles south of Boston. She was the youngest of 10 children of a consumptive mother who died a month after her birth. Charity's childhood was unhappy. Her father remarried when she was 2 to a woman who disliked her stepchildren and especially the youngest. Charity's older sisters married young to escape the family home, but Charity, who declared at age 23 that she would never marry, sought independence as a teacher and seamstress instead. Unfortunately, in each of the Massachusetts towns where Charity worked, damaging rumors spread about her character, seemingly related to the close relationships that she formed with other unmarried women in these towns. So driven from town to town at age 29, she finally fled Massachusetts to visit friends and relations in Weybridge, Vermont, where she met Sylvia Drake. Sylvia was born in 1784 in Easton, Massachusetts, a town on North Bridgewater's western border, the youngest of 8 siblings. Her family was one of many that descended into bankruptcy during the Revolutionary era, a misfortune that forced Sylvia's siblings and their widowed mother to migrate to the frontier community of Weybridge, Vermont at the turn of the century. There, Sylvia's older brothers and sisters married wisely and became respectable members of the property-owning class. But Sylvia herself avoided courtship, preferring to immerse herself in education and religion. She was 22 years old when Charity arrived in town, and already her family was beginning to consider her a spinster. And you can see that in letters where they're thinking about, like, who will Sylvia live with and what will we do with her? Soon after meeting, Charity and Sylvia became inseparable. Canceling her plans to return to Massachusetts at the end of what was supposed to be a visit of one season, Charity rented a room in Weybridge, where a month later, on July 3rd, 1807, Sylvia came to join her, ostensibly to help with Charity's sewing work, although, as Charity confessed in a letter to Sylvia, she really wanted her there for companionship. In fact, as Charity made clear in a 760-word account of her life written in 1844, from the outset, the women's choice to spend their lives together reflected their affective desires over practical considerations. Even more than that, her memoir suggested from the beginning that she and Sylvia lived together as a married couple. Charity was a master at writing puzzle-like rebus poems for friends. She was widely revered for this. People would ask her to write these sort of puzzle poems or acrostic poems. And so as a master of that form, Charity packed meaning into each word of her laconic assertion that Sylvia Drake, quote, consented to be my helpmeet and came to be my companion in labor, scratched through, on the 3rd day of July, 1807. To begin, Charity asserted that Sylvia had consented to their union. For nearly a millennium, consent had served as the touchstone of marriage in the European tradition, a legal doctrine that still held force in 19th century America. Neither a minister's presence nor a civil license were necessary if it could be proven that 2 people had consented to marry one another. Charity's next words, describing Sylvia as, quote unquote, my helpmeet, built her claim that the women's relationship was marital. She adopted the term from the book of Genesis, where God creates Eve as a helpmeet to Adam. In the Protestant culture of early America, helpmeet served as a common synonym for wife. This meaning was reinforced by Charity's use of the possessive my before the word helpmeet, according to coverture doctrine, which governed marriage law in early national America. A husband took control of his wife's property and body after the marriage. Charity used the semantic resonance of the possessive phrase, my helpmeet, to paint Sylvia as her spouse. Charity continued with the elaboration that Sylvia came to be my companion. The implication that Sylvia had left a prior home to join Charity established both that she and Sylvia began cohabitating on a specific date and that they resided under Charity's roof. These combined assertions again represented the relationship as marital, since following English precedent, early American legal scholars listed cohabitation as primary evidence of common law marriage along with consent. So if you wanted to prove that you were common law married, you said, well, we were known to consent to this and we began residing together. Equally important in New England social practice, couples typically marked their married lives as beginning when they quote unquote went to housekeeping under the husband's roof. Finally, by crossing out the words in labor, and this is the only correction that's made to the 1844 memoir, Charity emphasized that her life with Sylvia originated in love, not in economic pragmatism. Their relationship fit the new 19th century romantic definitions of marriage as a union of souls, as well as earlier colonial understandings of marriage as a productive partnership. Charity may have written the words in labor and then crossed them out on second thought, or perhaps she wrote the words with the intention to strike them through and correct any misapprehension by future generations. Either way, the women worked together in order to live together, not the other way around. In frontier New England during the first decade of the 19th century, marriage needed not be based primarily in affective bonds. Many marriages within the women's families were based around shared work rather than romantic love. Nonetheless, Charity's memoir stressed that affection, not labor, was the primary glue for her and Sylvia's household. As Charity rhapsodized in a spring 1808 love poem she wrote for Sylvia, they were united, quote, by every gentle tie that binds the tender heart. The tie that binds then, as now, was a common expression for marriage derived from the hymn, Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love, which was often sung at weddings. To symbolize this tie, Charity gave Sylvia a ring in the summer of 1808. Recognition of their marriage from family and community did not come all at once. It required years of living together and contributing to the community for the social fact of their marriage to acquire power. And they achieved this recognition against significant pushback. Once relocated to Vermont, Charity's Massachusetts family ceased to be able to, once Charity was relocated to Vermont, her Massachusetts family ceased to be able to exert control over her life. But many of the Drakes who lived in Weybridge and nearby Bristol rejected the women's household. Several of Sylvia's brothers never accepted the household, refusing to come to visit. Quote, they have said they did not wish to come here because there was no man for them to visit, she bemoaned in a letter to the one brother, Asaph Drake, who did sometimes visit. It wasn't just the men in the family who embargoed the household at first. For the first 7 years that Sylvia lived with Charity, Sylvia's mother, Mary, refused to visit their house. Despite living nearby and despite the previous closeness of their relationship, Sylvia and Mary saw each other on only a few occasions after Sylvia moved in with Charity. In 1813, Sylvia wrote to her mother to beg her to relent, acknowledging her, quote, wicked and abandoned life, but pleading for her mother's acceptance, not only for herself, but for Charity as well. Quote, may you, my dear mother, let her share with me your parental love. She well deserves it. She is everything I could wish, end quote. Finally, in spring 1815, after Charity and Sylvia had earned enough to enlarge their home beyond its initial 12 by 12 foot dimensions and build a private bedroom onto the house, Mary consented to come for a visit. The Drakes' disapproval was painful to Sylvia and Charity, but it wasn't insurmountable. For a variety of reasons that I expand on in the book, Charity and Sylvia ultimately found Weybridge hospitable enough to tolerate their household. Charity had a great deal to offer the Drakes and the frontier village from the cachet of her family name. So she was from like a very kind of a notable and well-respected, although not wealthy family, which helped the family to recover the social status they'd lost during the revolutions. The Drakes gained by being associated with the Bryants. She offered the town her superior tailoring skills, which permitted them to dress suitably. She offered the town strong relations with the village ministers, which helped to preserve their souls. These things helped secure the women's household in the town. And as the second generation of Drake nephews and nieces came of age, a generation who had never known anything different from the women's household, Aunt Charity and Aunt Sylvia increasingly came to be seen as pillars of respectability. The Bryant nephews and nieces saw the women's relationship the same way. William Cullen Bryant, the celebrated 19th century poet, who is also Charity's beloved nephew, described his aunt's marriage in a letter printed in his newspaper, the New York Evening Post, in 1843, which he later included in his 1850 volume, Letters of a Traveler. Recounting a visit he paid to the women's cottage, Cullen romanticized the women's union. Allow me to quote at length. "If I were permitted to draw aside the veil of private life, I would briefly give you the singular and to me most interesting history of two maiden ladies who dwelled in this valley. I would tell you how in their youthful days they took each other as companions for life, how this union no less sacred to them than the tie of marriage has subsisted in uninterrupted harmony for 40 years, during which they have shared each other's occupations and pleasures and works of charity while in health, and watched over each other tenderly in sickness, for sickness has made long and frequent visits to their dwelling. I could tell you how they slept on the same pillow and had a common purse and adopted each other's relations, and how one of them, more enterprising and spirited in her temper than the other, might be said to represent the male head of the family, and took upon herself their transactions with the world without, until at length her health failed, and she was tended by her gentle companion as a fond wife attends her invalid husband." William Cullen Bryant's description, structured according to the form for marriage in the Book of Common Prayer, described the union of his aunts as a marriage while simultaneously marking its difference from ordinary marriages. This rhetorical maneuver often appeared in accounts of the women's union from their time. So Hiram Harvey Hurlburt recalled hearing it mentioned as if Miss Bryant and Miss Drake were married to each other. Likewise, William Cullen Bryant's mother, Sarah Snell Bryant, wrote to the women, "I consider you both one as man and wife are one." Friends and family sometimes sidestepped the word marriage, instead calling attention to the state of union between Charity and Sylvia, which was another common colloquialism for marriage. Genesis 2:24 states that a man shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. So husbands and wives were seen as, quote, united in one body out of two by God. Even if they avoided using the word marriage to describe Charity and Sylvia's relationship, those who knew the women frequently called upon this marital image of oneness. Sylvia's brother Asaph wrote to Charity that, quote, "I consider you and my sister Sylvia happily one." Charity's friend and former lover Lydia wrote that, quote, "You are indeed in many respects so much one that a separation can scarcely be made." And in fact, the two women never did separate, living together, seemingly spending every single day and night of their shared lives together until October 1851, when Charity died of heart disease at age 74. Sylvia lived another 17 years, remaining half that time in the women's cottage before she finally moved into her older brother's more comfortable brick house, where she lived until her death in 1868. Afterwards, descendants of the Drake family buried her in the same grave as Charity and paid to erect a beautiful monument, springing extra to have the letters embossed on the headstone rather than engraved. The burial followed the standard for married couples in the village who, as quote unquote one flesh, were buried together, like the great patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been with their wives. According to St. Jerome, quote, those who are joined together in life should be joined together in a single tomb because they have become one flesh, and what God has joined together, man should not separate. So part 2, Miss Bryant was the man. The driving question behind Charity and Sylvia is, how did the couple achieve such remarkable recognition of their union from their religiously orthodox subsistence farming frontier community? And, as I alluded to before, there's no single answer to this question. A full explanation requires looking at the women's family relations, their roles in their church, tailoring business, literary productions, skills in the healing arts, as well as an inquiry into how what we now call the closet functioned in early America. But in the rest of the talk, I just want to pick up one piece of the equation, a piece of great significance, and that's how the women's use of the roles of man and woman or husband and wife helped create space for them in their community. So how did Charity and Sylvia achieve communal recognition by conforming to these categories, while at the same time redefining those categories and marriage itself? To begin, the documentary evidence makes abundantly clear that the women themselves, as well as their family, friends, and community, unequivocally identified Charity as the husband and Sylvia as the wife within their marriage. The recognizability of the women's marital roles smoothed the way to their acceptance. However, as two women performing the identities of husband and wife, Charity and Sylvia challenged both the conventional organization of these roles and the patriarchal nature of 19th century marriage itself. So let's begin with the federal census records, which cataloged the women's household every decade. The women first appeared in the census records in 1820. They were overlooked in the 1810 census, which would be the first decennial census where they were living together, probably because the census taker came by during the summer months. And in that summer, they were paying a visit to family in Massachusetts. So at that time, the federal census in 1820, when they first appeared, the federal census only recorded the names of heads of household. Other members of the household were categorized by sex, age, race, state of freedom, and other qualities deemed significant given the year, but not by name. In 1820, the census taker recorded Charity Bryant as the head of a household composed of two women, both in the 26 to 44-year age range. In 1830, the census taker recorded the head of the household as Charity Bryant, and also mistook Sylvia's age by a decade. And I have a theory for why, and you're welcome to ask during Q&A. So they mistook Sylvia for a decade younger than she was. In 1840, the census taker got both Charity's name and Sylvia's age right and recorded the existence of a third woman living in the household, probably one of the couple's apprentices, several of whom lived in the cottage with them for years at a time. Not until 1850, the year that the dependents' names finally entered the census, did Sylvia Drake's name appear in the rolls, and even then, her name was listed under Charity's according to the hierarchical logic of marriage. Charity's name was also the only one to appear on almost all of the women's joint business dealings. Charity kept running tabs for her customers, which was a necessity in a cash-poor economy where payment often took place in kind and the resolution of debts might require years. A typical account detailing work done for Mr. Jehiel Wright during 1827 and 1828 listed each of the items sewed for the client, the price for each item, the goods received in payment, for example, a portion of wheat valued at $3, and then closed with a final reckoning of the obligation. At the bottom of the record, it read, due to Miss Bryant, $3.83, which was followed by Charity's signature next to the words received payment. So in their business dealings, women conformed to the logic of 19th century marriage that placed all control over property in the name of the husband. Along with the privilege of ownership, 19th century husbands shouldered the responsibility of handling monetary exchanges in the public sphere. So Charity was the member of the couple who wrote dunning letters to clients who'd gotten too far behind on their debts. And Charity, despite often fragile health, made all the purchases required for the tailoring business in Middlebury. When making purchases on credit, Charity signed her name alone to the resulting debt. So here you have a sample debt, which is owed by Charity Bryant to S. Bell. In their social relations, as in their business relations, Charity presented the couple's public face. The two maintained a very busy correspondence over the years with family, friends, relatives, and ministers. Almost always, the letters to the couple came addressed to Charity on the outside, although the greetings inside extended to both women. Even Sylvia's own relations observed this rule. So when Sylvia's nephew, Azel Hayward, wrote to the women in 1825, giving an account of his legal studies in Massachusetts, he addressed the letter to Charity, then began the actual text of the letter with the words, "Dear Aunts." The rule for letter writing put the husband's name on the outside of the envelope. I'm sure that many of you were trained in that as a kid. I was. I don't know. I'm a university professor. I don't know if my 19 and 20-year-old students now still know that rule. But my grandparents observed it to the end. So I guess kids today don't learn how to write letters at all, so let alone who goes on the outside of the envelope. So also in polite conversation and writing, married women in the early 19th century often went unnamed except by their status as a man's relation. When Jonathan Hovey, a former Weybridge minister, wrote a letter to Sylvia's brother Asaph in 1820, he observed this rule for Charity and Sylvia, so saying hello to the men and then leaving the women unnamed. So his greetings in the letter read, please say hello to, quote, Brother Southworth and his family, to Miss Bryant and your sister, to Esquire Wright and his family, to Esquire Kellogg and his family, to the Mr. Bills and their families, to Mr. Hagar and his family, Mr. Brewster and his family, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Hovey named only the husbands and left their dependents unspecified, interweaving Charity and the unnamed Sylvia seamlessly into this mix. Charity joined the ranks of the Esquires, Misters, and Brethren, while Sylvia took her place among the families. Of course, the classic naming convention governing early American marriage was the rule that a wife assumed her husband's name, again stemming from the biblical doctrine that husband and wife were of one flesh. Perhaps in one idle moment, Sylvia flirted with the dream of expressing her wifely identity in this fashion. On an archived scrap of paper in Sylvia's handwriting, there survives a list of names that looks like practice towards a signature with big loops on the capitals. The list begins with the name Bryant and then reads Bryant Charity, and then plunges into a sequence of names, Bryant Sylvia, Bryant Sylvia, Bryant Charity, Bryant Sylvia. The fantasy of giving up her name for charities could have been appealing to Sylvia. Oh, here's that scrap of paper. But in early America, being a wife was not only about the renunciation of identity and passive subordination. For Sylvia, as for other wives, being a wife required vigorous management of the household. Sylvia devoted enormous labor to feeding the family and keeping the house. In her diary, she kept detailed records of the foods brought to the house by neighbors, family, and friends. For example, quote, Laura brings us calves' feet. Emma brings us bread, milk, and watermelon. Edwin calls, brings us applesauce, venison, and sausages. The deliveries might appear to be simple gifts, but they were in fact part of a complex exchange economy. In return for these deliveries, Sylvia made her own presents of food or work. In the rural 19th century economy, one person's surplus supplied another person's need. A separate food exchange record, which Sylvia kept for the years 1846 to 1847, noted names, dates, and amounts with precision. Each tablespoon of sugar was counted in future obligations. The record is a rare testimony to the complexity of the food exchange economy, which contributed as significantly to a family's upkeep as the monetary economy of the business world. Sylvia also prepared all the food for the couple, assisted by the apprentices who lived with them at times. Her diary is filled with accounts of baking bread, biscuits, cakes, pies, and cookies. Charity almost never prepared food for the family. Sylvia also did all of the housekeeping, which she resented for its tedium. Maintaining even a tiny house in the age before running water or electricity took an enormous outlay of time and effort. Quote, making fires, sweeping, washing, dishes, and cooking as usual occupied most of the day, Sylvia grumbled in a January 1822 diary entry. By working late into the night, Sylvia managed to combine these responsibilities with her tailoring work. Another diary entry captures this fatiguing double load. Quote, I spend Monday in taking care of meat, baking, sew the sleevelings and pockets and one seam on Mr. F's tunic, and make the buttonholes on one side, make the buttonholes on Mr. Lee's pants, and on Edwin's, sew down and stick the lapels to Mr. Pratt's box coat, make the buttonholes, make Edwin's vest and Mr. Bacon's, bake twice in the oven, and wash and iron a little. The only housekeeping activities that Charity took care of in husbandly fashion were simple home repairs and furniture maintenance. So on a warm summer afternoon, the quiet season for their business, Sylvia noted that while Charity, quote, mends the table, etc., Miss P and I need bread and biscuit. However, Charity's ability to fulfill the household maintenance chores performed by conventional husbands was limited by her sex and health. A short and often sickly woman, Charity could not chop wood efficiently. Like the men in her community, she didn't have the strength or the skills to build new rooms onto their house or to dig a well. Instead, she performed a different role as a female husband. Harder to see, but no less significant, Sylvia also performed a different role in her marriage than her sisters did in theirs as the wife to a female husband. I mean, most profoundly, she didn't spend her marriage engaged in pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and childbearing. So consequently, Charity and Sylvia's marriage itself, although it resembled marriages of their time, differed from the conventional model in profound ways. Charity's role as head of household, husband, or the man, however definitive, never overwrote her female identity as Miss Bryant. Her appearance projected a certain masculinity. She carried herself like a man and bore a strong resemblance to her brother Peter, William Cullen Bryant's father. But Charity did not pass as male-bodied. She wore traditional women's garments. At work, she wrapped her hair in a turban to keep it from her eyes, and she wore a plain dress made from wool and a calico apron. During her time, Charity's combination of masculine and feminine qualities recalled a familiar archetype known as the female husband. The female husband was a popular anti-hero in Anglo-American publications, periodicals and books and newspapers, first popularized by the British novelist Henry Fielding's true crime pamphlet, The Female Husband from 1746. Fielding's work launched a century of humorous writings about female-bodied cross-dressers who married women. But female husbands were not merely figments of the imagination dreamed up by satirists and pornographers. The term described a real, if atypical, variety of gender and sexual expression familiar in early America and Britain as well, where newspapers carried so many stories of female husbands that they became repetitive. In 1829, a Maine newspaper published a humorous anecdote in which a woman who sought a summons against her husband was asked by the judge, what, another female husband? No, she reassured the judge. Her husband was just a bigamist. In general, the stories about female husbands, though sensational, didn't treat their subjects as villains. The female husband's escapades were disreputable, but impressive. She personified admirable masculine qualities, including mastery, courage, and initiative. Charity shared these personality characteristics with the archetypal female husband, which made her appear appropriate to head the household. William Cullen Bryant wrote that his aunt was, quote, more enterprising and spirited in her temper than her companion, and thus naturally represented the male head of the family. Hiram Hurlburt remembered how the first time he entered the women's shop as a boy, Charity had pointed a finger at him and commanded, "You will wait." She then put Hiram in his place by naming his entire family lineage before permitting him to approach the cutting table. Her demonstration of mastery led Hiram to the conclusion that it was perfectly proper for her to be, quote unquote, the man. Since her youth, Charity had expressed a superior temperament that led her family to teasingly address her as your ladyship. After the move to Vermont, her dominating personality enabled her to transition from a lady to a female husband. As wife to a female husband rather than to a man, Sylvia secured a degree of independence and civic identity ordinarily denied to wives. She was able to preserve her status as a femme sole rather than as a femme covert, and she maintained a legal claim to the couple's joint property. Even though Charity's name appeared alone in the federal census records of the household, both women's names appeared in local financial records, in effect, dividing their joint property between them. In the local tax records, where the names of household heads ordinarily appeared on their own, Charity's name appeared first, followed by Sylvia's. Both women owed a joint obligation on their joint property. The women applied the same logic to estimating their own tax to the local Weybridge Female Benevolence Society. And so too in land records, Charity's name came first, with Sylvia's name appearing afterwards. A legal contract with their landlord in the 1830s guaranteed the right to, quote, peacefully possess, occupy, and enjoy all the buildings heretofore erected by the said Charity and Sylvia during the natural lives of the said Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. In private records, Sylvia also staked a clear claim to the women's joint assets. The tailoring shop belonged to both women, even if Charity's name alone appeared on the accounts. Sylvia recorded all the daily work that the women performed in her diary, keeping careful track of the business. She valued her claim to their joint property for more than material reasons. She derived self-worth from her financial independence. One wintry evening, in a gloomy mood, she sat down to write out an informal will for the eventual disposition of her property. And she described the small wealth that she had accumulated as the result of her own hard work, ably supported by Charity. Quote, should the sudden stroke of death lay my frail body cold in the grave, perhaps some friend might like to know my wish respecting my little that I leave. Hard work and close calculation will not accumulate properties unless you have confidence and a disposition to demand something for your labor. To the beloved Miss Bryant, I am indebted for all the confidence I possess, and generally for making a demand for my just due. We have toiled day and night almost, and now it is my wish she should enjoy peaceable and quiet by and during her natural life, my share of the house we have built together and all the household furniture, with some little exceptions, which I shall name. The women's legal wills, carried out several decades later, put this vision that Sylvia had into effect. Charity, the elder, left a will that sought to guarantee Sylvia's claim on their joint home. The will named Sylvia as the executrix and indicated that Charity's real estate was, quote, owned by the deceased in common with Drake. Sylvia worried about the Bryant relation's possible reactions to the will, but nephew Oliver Bryant assured Sylvia that she need not worry about, quote, offending any of our family by any disposition of matters and things relating to yourself and Aunt C. So without objections from Charity's relatives, the probate court approved Sylvia's handling of the will, and the year after Charity's death, Sylvia appeared in the village's tax records as the sole owner of the women's residence. 17 years later, the first instruction in Sylvia's will set aside half of her property, both personal and real, to Oliver Bryant and another Bryant niece. Charity and Sylvia had earned their property through joint effort, and each possessed just title to half the accumulated wealth. In traditional Anglo-American law, a woman inherited a life interest in 1/3 of her husband's property to be distributed among the children following her death. Charity, on the other hand, left all her real property to Sylvia with the understanding that following Sylvia's death, the property would be evenly divided between the two women's respective families. The women's commitment to a reconceived egalitarian vision of the marital union may help explain why in their private addresses to each other, Charity and Sylvia used common synonyms for spouse that connoted their equal standing. They saw their relationship as a marriage, but in private, they didn't necessarily embrace the words husband or wife. Sylvia often used the word companion to describe Charity. A diary entry from 1835 described Charity as, quote, her who has been my companion ever since 1807. In a loving flourish, Sylvia once referred to Charity as, quote, the companion of my way. Elsewhere, Sylvia referred to Charity as her beloved friend, coincidentally the same term of address that self-assertive wife Abigail Adams used for her husband, President John Adams. Charity reciprocated, describing herself as Sylvia's friend in most of her poems. Like Sylvia, she sometimes embellished the word, calling Sylvia, quote, the friend of my heart, or my faithful friend. Charity swore to the tremendous value she placed on the word friend as, quote, from the dearest of titles I would not be free, for what millions of treasures could buy. The term of address friend implied no diminution of feelings to either women, although it might read that way to us today. Often friends and family also described the women's union in language that alluded to their even footing. Lydia Richards, their friend Lydia Richards, described the women as partners, another vernacular for spouse in the 18th and 19th centuries. Charity's closest cousin, Vesta Guild, described Sylvia in a letter to Charity as, quote, your other self, capturing both the marital oneness, linking Charity and Sylvia, and the symmetry of the women's relations. This was a marital conjoining, not only ordered vertically in the manner of head and heart, common metaphor for marriage in the early 19th century, but also horizontally, self and self, two equal beings. Short conclusion, and then I think we'll have time for questions. So return to the images that began our talk. What should we make of the apparent sameness of the women's profiles? How can we understand their differences from each other and from other marriages of their day? When I began this research project in the summer of 2005, I brought the assumption that Charity and Sylvia's marriage diverged radically from others at that time. That divergence, of course, is what made the project interesting to me. I thought these women were rebels. And then as I investigated their lives further, I couldn't escape the sinking realization that they weren't so rebellious after all. They were stalwarts of their church. They personified genteel respectability. They divided their marriage according to that most unradical of binaries, husband and wife. In fact, it began to seem the most radical thing about this same-sex marriage may have been how conservative it was. Finally, after some helpful prodding, I reconsidered my conclusions and backtracked from my argument that Charity and Sylvia fully embody the traditional roles of husband and wife. That argument couldn't explain why William Cullen Bryant called his aunts, quote, two maiden ladies, or why Sylvia's name appeared alongside Charity's in land records and tax records. The evidence suggested that each woman preserved her identity as a femme soul, even as they insisted on being recognized as a union. One could read that incongruity as evidence that they were not really married. As the women's friend Anna Hayden put it, Charity and Sylvia were nearly one. They were almost as one, but they also remained separate. Or one could read this preservation of the women's identities as femme souls as their effort to reimagine, through the formation of a same-sex union, what it meant to be a married woman. By binding herself to another woman, each enjoyed a degree of independence that she could not have maintained if married to a man. Of course, I expect some people who hear this talk or read the book will question my conclusion that Charity and Sylvia's union should be called a marriage. A lot of the historiography on marriage is focused on its qualities as a legal institution. But this attention to marriage as a legal institution, attention to marriage as a legal institution was compounded by the importance of the battle over the legalization of same-sex marriage during the decade that I was writing this book and shortly after its publication. But although no judicial body ever ruled on the question of whether or not Charity and Sylvia's union constituted a legal marriage, I think it's probably fair to guess that if the question had arisen, the answer would have been negative. But I would argue that in the early 19th century, even today, marriage should not be defined only as a legal status, but also as a social fact performed and realized through communal recognition. Excluding relationships that were communally recognized as marriages from the history of marriage denies the institution's social reality. Marriage as a historical practice always existed beyond statute. There's lots of illegal marriages in the early 19th century. For example, marriages between enslaved people who were legally incapacitated from entering that contract, or bigamous marriages, which were plentiful, as again, that joke points out. And so socially recognized marriages between same-sex spouses should be recognized as no less real than those other examples. And, in conclusion, I think it's this very tendency to cordon off relationships like Charity and Sylvia's into an analogic netherworld, sort of like a marriage, but not a marriage, a pale imitation of the real, not something real itself, that ultimately pushed me to treat the women's union as the people who knew them did, in the words of Hiram Hurlburt, as if Miss Bryant and Miss Drake were married to each other. All right, I will cut off there. Thank you for your patience. Oh, I can't hear you. You're muted.
I am. You think that would be a lesson I'd have learned by now, but
all of us.
Thank you so much. That was really wonderful. We have a few questions that I'll bring up to you. And a reminder to everyone who has been watching along that the Q&A function, which is on your taskbar, is a great way to address questions, and I will then address them to our speaker. So our first question comes from Martha, who asks, is their home in Weybridge extant? And if so, where was it located?
No, it's not. So the brick house that Sylvia died in is absolutely still standing in Weybridge, and I think it's on like Morgan Horse Farm Road or something. It's been a while since I've been able to visit. And it actually came on the market recently. I looked at it on Zillow. I was so tempted. I didn't have the $1 million+ it took to buy the house, and I live in Canada, but believe me, I was very tempted. So yeah, so like that's still standing. The house that Charity and Sylvia built initially was, like I said, a 12 by 12 foot structure on someone else's land. That's why there was that weird wording in that that deed with their landlord, because they didn't own the land underneath it. And I would not imagine that it was built to last. And then, later on in their marriage, they built additions onto the house, but it was always sort of, I think, a ramshackle tiny cottage. And then it disappeared at some point. So there are people in town who thought it was located on what's now Drake Road, but I don't think that's the case, because they were not renting the land from the Drakes, but from this other family, the Hagars. And so when I was researching the book, I went looking for it with some like local people who, knew the property history really well. And we found some sumac trees, and a lot of the time people say, I guess sumac trees grow where there used to be outhouses. So we sort of found a spot, which we thought was likely the spot, like judging from the, plots from, in the town records from the 1830s. Like I knew where roughly the farm was, where their house was located, and then but yeah, nothing remains of it.
Yeah, that's too bad. Another question from an anonymous attendee asks, did they have any community with other women who were in relationships with other women?
Kind of. So as I mentioned in the talk, Charity, before she was 29 when she came to Weybridge, and she had spent a lot of time engaging in sort of like deep romantic relationships with other women. And then she kept in touch with a lot of those women. They became sort of like lifelong friends of Charity and Sylvia's. But it was almost impossible for women in the first half of the 19th century to achieve what Charity and Sylvia did, which was like a stable, independent household of 2 women. It was very hard for women to earn wages that were high enough to support an independent living. Like Charity was rare because she had specialized skills as a tailoress. So she wasn't just a seamstress who did sewing work. She was able to create items of clothing And this was a period before there's patterns for sewing your own clothing. So it was like a skill that you had to learn, like actually how you take like a two-dimensional textile and turn it into a three-dimensional item of clothing with like movement, you know? So I don't know if anyone's ever tried to like sew a shirt without a pattern, and you end up like, you're like, I can't move my arms because, right, we're not trained. So anyway, so Charity had this rare skill that made their household possible, and only possible because they worked like 15-hour days, 7 days a week for their entire lives, right? So most of the women who Charity had sort of like romantic friendships with were not able, even if they wanted that life, and some of them clearly did, they were not able to create it for themselves. So like one of them remained single in her parents' house forever, and then finally like married as an older woman, and like post childbearing, and then was like terribly abused by her husband's kids. And anyway, so yeah, you know, not really. There was not, in the second half of the 19th century, things changed enormously. But in the first half of the 19th century, there just wasn't enough possibility for women to live independently, to have big circuits of, you know, women in same-sex relationships.
Yeah, thank you. Peter asks, is there an example of courts not applying the English common law rule of inheritance by a traditional wife from a deceased husband? I'm reading the question out, and Peter, if you can clarify your question. Does that question work for you, Rachel? I'm trying to parse it.
No,
Sorry.
I'm not entirely sure what Peter's asking.
Yeah.
Is Peter asking whether there's any decisions where courts are asked to judge on the legality of a same-sex marriage and say it's not legal? Is that the question?
By traditional wife, deceased husband. I believe so. Peter, you can follow up if that is not your question, but I think that's probably a good question to start with, since you talked a little bit about the court-defined legality of marriage at the end of your talk.
It does come up, right? Because so there's this common genre of female husband stories, and often what happens is that husbands who, you know, we would probably understand as trans men today, right? But people who were assigned female at birth but lived their lives as men, there would be a marriage dissolution, and then the female husband would be exposed by the wife who was, you know, seeking revenge or seeking property or whatever it was. Other times female husbands are exposed because they die in like a workplace accident or something happens, you know, and the doctor administers to them and discovers, lo and behold, the person's body is female. And so there are examples where judges are sort of puzzling over, well, was it, you know, this marriage does appear to be a legal marriage, and what do I do with it? And so there's sort of a variety of cases. I talk about some of them in an article I wrote in 2015 that's published in the Journal of American History called What? Another Female Husband? So there are in fact some cases, and actually some that involve men married to trans women as well. So like men married to people who were assigned male at birth, but who lived as women. There are some examples from like the 19th century and early 20th century where judges say, like, in essence, this is a legal marriage. I know it's completely in conflict with this whole notion, you know, that like same-sex marriage is like newer than cell phones. It's just not. That's a misreading of history.
Yeah, thank you. Jan asks, was the spot where you found those sumac trees right next to the Hagar farm today? I guess there's still a Hagar farm in Weybridge today.
There is still a Hagar farm, but I think there's the Hagar farm, there's like that's near the cemetery. And this, I think, was on the other side of the cemetery, because there were, again, there were a lot of Hagars in Weybridge, right? So it's not the one that's just on the other, it's not on the one where you can go buy the chocolate milk. It's on the other side, but it's not far. I mean, I don't know, half a mile.
Great, thank you. We have time for one last question. So I will ask the top one here. Thomas asks, when did Sylvia move to her brother Asaph's house, and did Charity live there as well?
No, it was after Charity died. So Sylvia remained in the house they had created for themselves for like I don't know, 8 years or something. And then after that, Sylvia moves in with her brother, like when she's an old woman and I guess she can't live by herself anymore, or her family wants her to, you know, be living with other people. And so Charity never died there. Charity never lived there. Charity and Asaph, though, had a often quite close friendship, to the point that Asaph asked Charity to name at least one of his children. So Charity was quite close with Sylvia's brother for a while, and these family relationships went through, you know, periods of intimacy and periods of estrangement, and for various reasons, not all related to the fact that the women were in a same-sex marriage, but, you know, like religious disagreements and financial disagreements and all the things that, you know, family members divide over and unite over.
Great. It is 1 o'clock. I know there are a few more questions, but so this is my good moment to say to you that I strongly urge you all to read the truly wonderful book. You saw the cover of it at the very end of the talk there with the same title as our talk, Charity and Sylvia, A Same-Sex Marriage in Early America. It is an absolute masterwork in finding and interpreting sources, and I think an excellent model for Vermont history and telling stories of people who had been previously overlooked in historical records through some really careful, close reading of sources. So thank you so much for doing the research and writing the book. And we would be delighted to host you again if you ever touch on Vermont history again going forward.
Always a dream.
Yeah, we would be absolutely delighted to have that. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I should also pass on that there are quite a few people in the chat who are saying thank you for a wonderful presentation. I should pass those on as well to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And next month, we will be sharing, we will continue our speaker series with Room for Improvement, Landscape, Social Uplift, and the Changing Nature of Vermont with Sarah Gregg on April 27, 2022. And as a last note, this talk has been recorded, and it will be shared to our YouTube channel in 7 to 10 days. If you have received a notice of this program in your email inbox, because you pre-registered, you will also receive the link to that program in your email inbox. So please remember to check out vermonthistory.org and look forward to future programming from the Vermont Historical Society. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day.